I think what drives me doing the work is, in our situation, if you are actually looking for social change, you would generally get involved in politics or political action. But actually, in Northern Ireland, where we've had so many decades of violence, the political system was itself very divided. So there was no automatic party that you could necessarily relate to. So a lot of people of my age and of my period really went into civil society instead of into mainstream politics as a way of actually achieving social change. And for me then, I got involved in community action and supporting community development. So working with people in perhaps the most marginalised communities. And within that then, I think one of the things that maintained the motivation was the enthusiasm and the voluntary interest of people that were living with issues of poverty and violence and challenge. The Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, because of the divided society in which it was located or is located, always had a very clear ethos to its work, as a way of actually providing a baseline for the Board of Trustees and staff and the people that we were working with. And it was threefold. One, a belief in the power of collective action and local people mobilising themselves to both identify the issues that they felt were priorities, but also to identify solutions to those issues and supporting community action. The second was around a concept of social justice, that more equitable societies actually work better for people, but also work better as abiding by the idea of a good society. And the third ethos was around the power of peace building and the fact that we had 30 years of violence in the street, bombs going off every day, shootings and so forth. And the belief that no matter how deep the divisions and how long the violence goes on for, at the end of the day, people are going to have to talk. So it's trying to create the framework where those talks could start. We have a number of issues. In Northern Ireland, we still have issues of community relations. We still have 49 peace walls in Belfast, 30-foot high walls dividing communities. So that's still an issue, particularly where it divides young people. The divisions are still as deep, despite the fact that we no longer have violence in the street, or certainly not armed violence in the street. We still do have quite a lot of riots. We have a major issue at the moment of poverty. As in many European countries, we've had extensive welfare reform cutbacks. So those communities that were probably the poorest anyway are being further disadvantaged, which is somewhat ironic given that it was not those communities that created the economic problems that we have. And that is an issue that's not just for Northern Ireland. Clearly, it's across the UK, it's certainly in the Republic of Ireland, and indeed in many, Spain, Portugal, many European countries. But the other issue I think that we do have, and we're not transnationally, and we're not actually addressing it well, is the fact that borders are now more porous. And we have immigrant communities coming into our countries, and the reaction that we're getting is for people to try and put up the fences higher. And I don't think that that is rational, given that the raison d'etre of the European Union is open borders and open economies. So you can't have open economies on the one hand and try and control the immigration flows on the other. So that's an issue that I think we have to deal with. And lastly, I think there is an issue that's bubbling away under the surface about the whole change in international relations and the sort of the balance of power and the ability of things that happen perhaps many countries away to have a destabilising influence. And we haven't yet come to grips, I think, with how countries relate effectively to one another. I think we were perhaps more open in the 90s, Well, we have actually gone backwards a bit more recently. And the whole issue of the change in status of the United States, I think, is a core to that. But more importantly, their need to recognise their change in status, that countries like China and so forth, and indeed Latin American countries, have as much right to have a say in the global balance as the more traditional northern and western countries. Yeah, that's a difficult question. One of the, whether it's actually individual, but well, there are individuals. Within the United Kingdom context, I would have always looked towards Stephen Pittam, who was the trust administrator of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, a very well-established Quaker foundation, in terms, again, of the sort of very grounded, principled approach to both the power of philanthropy, but also a very critical approach, self-critical approach in terms of the exercise of power. And in the philanthropy world, I don't think we're good at recognising the power we have. And if we don't recognise it, then there's a danger that we don't use it either effectively or we can use it in the wrong way. Secondly, I think there's some very dynamic foundation leaders like Lisa Jordan, the Bernard von Leer Foundation in The Hague. And indeed, there's also, I think, a growth in interesting foundation leaders outside Europe and America. Akwasi Aidu that runs the Trust Africa Foundation. And I think that's actually really refreshing, because when we're seeing foundations emerging in Africa that are native to Africa and to Asia and to Latin America, they actually are bringing a different frame of reference than what we have probably adopted from America. And I think that is actually very healthy. So those sort of leaders would be the ones that I probably would look to. And then there would be sort of leaders, I suppose, in terms of academic thinking, Ignatieff in Canada, and people that are actually looking at politics, and the sort of people that are trying to reconceptualize politics. Because I do think, and perhaps it should have been one of the issues I mentioned, we are facing a problem that politics has become the management of the state. Politics should be the struggle for imagination. And that, I think, is something that we perhaps haven't seen enough of. 2040, when I will be pushing up the daisies probably, I would like to see civil society, first of all, being inclusive in terms of intergenerational. I think that we haven't been very effective over the last couple of decades about making room for young people. Young people were to the fore of activism in the late 60s, 70s period, into the 80s. I feel we've closed down opportunities for them, and we need to have to create the space to allow young people to create their own civil society. Now, I know that they are doing that through the social media and through sort of Facebook and so forth, and that can be good. It can also be bad in that sometimes I think if we have too many of our conversations at the virtual level, we actually exclude people who are perhaps in the most marginalised and disadvantaged circumstances, because they're not always engaged at that level. So it needs to be, yes, there should be room for the new forms of communication, but there also needs to be the room for conversations with people who are also can be excluded. I think one of the things that by 2040 we will have, or certainly I would like to see having, is that we have far more conversations and exchanges across national borders, and particularly outside the sort of Western Northern power block, if you like, into Latin America, into Asia, into Africa. Because up to now, I think we still have had almost like the remains of our 19th century colonialism, where all the sort of the ideas were focused in that geographic block, whereas we need to leave it open by 2040 to the new ideas coming in from the Chinas, from the Africas and so forth.